Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning from those from the US, including our guest. Welcome to the 64th EOcafe, and the first one since the summer break, so the first one of our autumn season. Hopefully, we'll have a lot of interesting discussions this in the next couple of months. Hope that everyone had a good summer. Certainly, we're going through a hot spell in Brussels at the moment. But I mean, there's been so many extreme events around Europe. I hope you've all managed to avoid them, avoid the fires and the floods and whatever else. It certainly seems that these are becoming more frequent and maybe even more extreme. There was some better news today because the UK has rejoined Horizon 2020 and more significantly the Copernicus program. Of course, it's being boosted up, but I don't think the conditions change too much. But that should at least overcome the budget shortfall on Copernicus for the next round of Sentinels. So, for anybody who is new, just a reminder of the rules for the EOcafe. The idea is that we're sitting here having a chat with our guest, and you're listening in. After about half an hour, we will invite questions. Please put questions into the chat beforehand so that we can see what's coming up, and then I can call you to give your question. Please keep your microphones off unless you're called to participate. But you're very welcome to keep the cameras on, and it's always good to see people in the audience. So please feel free to show yourselves. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome an international guest from the US, Victoria Sampson, who is in the Washington office, director of the Secure World Foundation. Now, Secure World Foundation is a not-for-profit organization based in the US. They used to have an office in Brussels, and our own Natasha was in that office, but I think it closed about 2013, 2012.
Roughly about then, yeah.
Yeah, so not so visible today, but hopefully we'll learn more about what the Secure World Foundation is and what they're doing. So it's an organization that works towards secure, sustainable, peaceful uses of outer space, trying to contribute to global stability, which is certainly something ambitious and very much welcome at the moment. But we'll learn more about it. So let me start by welcoming Victoria. And Victoria, maybe as a kickoff, you could introduce yourself, a little bit about yourself, a little personal history, and tell us about the Secure World Foundation.
Sure. Hi, Jeff. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. It's my first time on your cafe, and it's good to be back in the office, I guess. Get our fall off right. So my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. As Jeff said, the Secure World Foundation is a private nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. And as Jeff said, we used to have an office in Brussels. And I miss Natasha dearly. We were just discussing, it's been a decade since we were colleagues. It just feels like yesterday. Yeah, so we have two offices, one in DC and one is our headquarters in Boulder. Secure World's kind of unusual for a nonprofit in that we have pretty much an individual donor. Our founder is a woman named Cinda Collins Arsenault, who wanted to put her money towards something that would help out humanity and identified space as a common issue area that cuts across a lot of different portfolios. And so we realized next year is our 20th anniversary as a Secure World Foundation. I've been there for 14 years of it. I've got a nice rut dug in there. I love working there. So it's been a great place to work on because we've been working on sustainability for 20 plus years. And when we first started working on it, not a lot of people were discussing it. It was, kind of a niche issue. So it's been very heartening to see a lot of other people and organizations take up the idea that space is an environment that needs to be maintained and protected, again, for the help of humanity. We're also unusual for a space-related organization, and that we don't really push for space exploration. God love it. Good for those who can do it. You can never get me into spaceship, but I understand there are people that like to do that sort of thing, and it's has its benefits. But what we really look at is, how does space help life on this planet? And so we look at things that affect space sustainability. And if you ask my colleagues, I think we would each come up with a different definition of what is space sustainability. Is it space debris? Is it launch sequence or cadence? Is it space security? Is it commercial space? Is it, space law? It's all those things. You also wanted me to talk a little bit about my background. So my background is in security issues. I started off with a degree in international relations. And when I got out of grad school, I looked for jobs, but the only people hiring at that point were the U.S. Department of Defense. They always had plenty of money. And so my first job out of grad school was working for scripting wargaming scenarios, what is now the Missile Defense Agency's Director of Intelligence. And I did that for a couple of years and absolutely hated it. And then switched to the light side, switched to arms control. And so that's where I've been working on ever since. I did almost a decade at a think tank looking at missile defense, nuclear weapons, and space was kind of an offshoot of my work on missile defense. And so when Secure World wanted to establish their DC presence, they knew me from my work there and asked me if I wanted to apply for the job. At that point, I had zero interest in space, but I had moved away from DC temporarily and I wanted a reason to get back. And so I'm like, yeah, I'll take the job. And I figured I'd do it for a year or two, refresh my DC contacts, and then move on. And as I said, that was 14 years ago. So my particular interest is the security and stability aspects of space and how that affects sustainability, because I think you really, truly can't have one without the other. I work on, and I'm sorry, Jeff, I'm just like talking here, so feel free to interrupt me at any point.
That's okay,
I could talk
Victoria.
for a whole
We're
hour, so
here
maybe
just
you
to
want to
talk,
stop me.
so that's fine. You elaborated a list of issues there and topics, which I think are the ones that we will come back to. So
Great.
certainly highly relevant and really putting it. I mean, defence and security, as you know, in Brussels is a difficult topic. Because defence is very much the domain of the member states, and the S in GMES that became Copernicus was for security, but civil security is well covered, but the sort of more closely defence-related aspects are still being examined and still being looked at in relation to Copernicus. And I was part of a working group last year that elaborated the need to try to reinforce the links, but recognizing that Copernicus is a civilian system, that the defense side is relevant and very important. And I think that's becoming even clearer today. But before sort of going too far down that path, I just wanted to come back to Secure World Foundation, because
Sure.
you've recently announced or launched a space security portal, which has brought together different initiatives, a registry, a taxonomy. Could you tell us a little bit about that project and what it's achieving?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So we worked on this for over a year with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, or UNIDIR. They're kind of like the think tank for the Secretary General. They're based in Geneva at the Conference of Disarmament there, and we have a great relationship with them. We do a lot of stuff with them. Probably talk more about their work later. So the thinking was, we wanted to help improve transparency and understanding about various issues. And one of those is just looking at, well, what are countries' policies? What are their statements? What are their budgetary priorities? What sort of treaties have they signed to, and which ones haven't they signed to? And so the thinking behind the Space Security Portal, which is spacesecurityportal.org, hopefully a pretty easy URL for you to remember. Basically, what you can do is we have some geographically representative countries there, not the whole, not every country on the planet, but we're hoping soon. And even though it's called a space security portal, it truly is more of a space policy portal, and that you can click on those countries and you can see, okay, what is do they have legislation on space? If so, what does it say? Have they made any statements about, did they have a strategy for space? Did they anything specifically? What have they done votes on specific, UN resolutions on space security, that sort of thing. So it's just, a lot of it is self-reported. We're taking inputs from the governments themselves. We released it officially just a couple weeks ago, so it's brand new. But again, their thinking was, it's hard to take actions without having a holistic view in terms of how does that fit into what a country has prioritized and what do they put their efforts into. And so just by looking at policies, we feel that's a really good transparency and confidence building measure just to clarify intent and interest and goals for various countries. So we'll see how it works out. So far, we're also hoping it would be a great resource for researchers to look at things. I know I've spent decades working on these issues, but I will say, for example, the United Nations website is atrocious. And every time I need to find a resolution and find who sponsored a resolution, it takes forever. And so
Yeah.
we're hoping to help out other researchers by, cutting out the middleman and putting the links directly to these primary sources.
Yeah. Well, I guess people can find it. It's as you say, there's a few countries in there at the moment, a few representative countries, but the idea is to expand on that. And it seems to me knowing where the different countries stand, what the treaties they have signed up to, what the governance is in that country is also covered. So who are the key organizations? Where are they reporting? Is going to become a really important issue over the next 5 years or so, I think. Partly for the reasons that we're going to talk about today. The increasing interest and the increasing geostrategic dimension of what we're doing, which I see as very concerning. In terms of the coverage, I think you said there that you want to try and cover every country. That seems very ambitious, but that's the goal, is it? Or
Is ambitious. Right now, like I said, we've got a few countries from like Latin America. I want to say Brazil, Argentina, U.S., UK, Russia, China. Kind of the P5, India, and then I want to say Japan. Definitely South Korea. So
Mm,
just kind of scattering to just get a sense of where these countries are and that sort of thing. But it takes a lot of input to do. And as I said, we worked on it for the better part of a year. A lot of that was building the back end. And to that, hats off to my colleagues at Unidir. They did, especially Sarah Erickson. They did just an absolutely amazing job working on it. It's been a real honor to be able to contribute to this project.
yeah.
But again, we've already had countries that weren't included, reach out to us, be like, why weren't we included? We're like, well, hey guys, give us the information. We're happy to add you in. So I'm not saying naming and shaming, but we're hoping to inspire countries to help with this sharing information as needed.
Yeah, we use that tactic as well. So, well, I hope it's successful. Maybe somebody can pop the link into the chat so that people can go and see it. But recognizing that it is work in progress. But I think it's a tool that will become extremely useful. Um, so the space security has really taken another turn recently with the successful landing of an Indian mission on the moon, which makes India the fourth country to achieve this goal. We've heard just this morning that Japan has made another launch to put a lander, which would make it the fifth. It's their third attempt, so they're very serious in the objective. So the question is this the start of a new space race in some way, which is where we started with our title for the call today. So to look at the issues surrounding this. If so, where is this race headed? Victoria, what's your perspective on what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, it's complicated.
Mm,
Generally speaking, I have difficulty with the concept of a space race because someone's like, well, the race to where? To what end? What are you trying to achieve? Um, I know Americans always like to say, hey, we won the space race. We got to the moon first. And I'm like, well, guys, that was 50 plus years ago. Plus, if you look at what the Soviet Union, space program was able to accomplish, they accomplished a lot more things. We just happen to be the ones that got to the moon first. So, different definitions of, who won that. But I think there is, and then, kind of an evolution in how countries are using space and how they're using their space programs. It used to be a major space power was one that had satellites. And then okay, a lot of countries have satellites. Which countries can launch their own satellites? And to this day, there's still only about a dozen countries that can launch satellites. But even so, it's becoming less. So, is it a country that has a counter space program? We put out a document, a global counter space threat assessment, that's put out every year annually. It's open source information about counter space capabilities. We cover about 11 countries. And every year we're always like, well, there's a couple more, maybe we should or not. But again, roughly about a dozen. So, is that what's a major space program? Is a major space program one that can do space exploration? Is it one that can get to the moon? The Center for Security International Studies, CSIS, put out a study last year where they talked about 19 countries' moon plans over the next decade or so. So there's a lot of countries that are planning on orbiting the moon, maybe not getting to the moon, but landing on the moon, doing some sort of moon rover or being a payload on someone else's rover. So there's a lot of stuff happening there, and so maybe it's the big thing now. If you want to be a major space power, you have to have the ability to go to the moon. Okay, and then maybe it's not just to go to the moon. Now it's to go to the South Pole of the moon, which is the big thing now. I will point out, even though India landed near the South Pole of the moon, and the U.S. is going to try to do it, Japan, as far as I know, their mission that they just launched is not intended to land it near the South Pole of the moon. They've got a different area picked out, a basin that's supposed to be easier to land on, rather than the South Pole, which is kind of rocky. So yeah, so it's kind of complicated. What's trying to happen there? So I'm always like, well, maybe. I do see, there is, I won't say competition, but if you look at countries' planned landing sites on the moon, a lot of countries are planning to try and land near the South Pole of the moon. China, United States, Russia have all put out landing sites, and some of them do overlap a little bit. And this is largely because it is anticipated that there are ice crystals down there. And if there are ice crystals, there's a possibility for water that could be used to help with crewed missions later on the moon, or even further past the moon out to Mars and further human exploration. But I mean, just because there are landing sites that are near each other does not mean that they're going to be instantly overlapping each other. There is a TV show in the United States called The Space Force, where the U.S. was in competition with the Chinese over the moon, and you had astronauts sabotaging each other over taikonauts and doing all that. I don't think anyone envisions that sort of competition because the moon is hard, and so you don't want to make an already harsh living environment even more complicated by unnecessarily adding danger to other humans up in space. But there could be competition over the better landing sites. One of the things about the Artemis Accords that the United States has been promoting, that 27 countries have signed on to, is the idea of pulling out principles from the Outer Space Treaty, but also looking at, okay, what other concepts are needed as we evolve how we use space? As how do we have a civil human exploration that can be done in a way that's helpful to all? And so the Artemis Accords, I said, pulls out the principles from the Outer Space Treaty. They also identify things like deconfliction and coordination of sharing scientific data specific to things like on the moon. The idea that even if the United States and China have a complicated relationship and don't really cooperate in space, they still need to coordinate in space. So yeah, that was a long-winded response to I don't know, maybe sort of there's a space race.
But I mean, from what you say there, you suggest, I read it, that you believe that the missions are scientific in nature rather than being of a status or a strategic positioning.
Well, I mean, I think that those are kind of different sides to the same coin. I mean, when you look right down to it, there's obviously scientific benefits from being in space and exploring in space, but I don't think you can separate that from the national prestige aspect. That's always been part of anyone's space program from the beginning of the space age. And then it's really hard to to separate that from security implications, whether you're talking geopolitical rivalry or things of that nature. I will say the Outer Space Treaty is extremely clear on this matter. Article 4 says no military missions on the moon or other heavenly bodies. So I'm sorry, no military installations on the moon or other heavenly bodies. So not to sound naive, but very clear on that matter. But I mean, there's always been, I think, there's not really been a strong separation between civil space and security space for many countries' space programs. Like I will say, the head of the Chinese human spaceflight program is also the head of their anti-satellite testing program. So it's really hard to say specifically, this is a security issue and this is a scientific issue. There's kind of one help leads to the other. But I will say, I probably, there is geopolitical bragging rights
Mm.
involved. And the other thing I see in terms of competition on the moon, I mentioned the Artemis Accords, which is in theory open to anyone. Surprise, surprise, China and Russia have not signed them and probably will not. Instead, they've got their own proposal for an International Lunar Research Station, or ILRS, with the idea that they would have a series of moon missions leading to some sort of crewed habitable thing, mission, research station, I guess is what they want to call it, sometime after 2030. I forget that timeline. Although Russia's recent crash on the moon does probably impact that a little bit. But I mean, so in theory, a country could sign on to the Artemis Accords and also cooperate with China and Russia on ILRS. Now, our countries are going to actually do that. I think some countries are worried that they can't do both. Like they'll be, if they want to work with the United States, for example, they can't do something close to China because of export control restrictions. The UAE has already pulled out of a joint program with the Chinese for that exact reason. But if you see, okay, well, we're kind of bifurcating and seeing these two different ways of having, governance on the moon. You have the Artemis Accords and the ILRS, even though ILRS hasn't really talked about the principles too much. I mean, right now, there are officially three countries in ILRS: China, Russia, Venezuela. South Africa reportedly has said in the past week or so that they were going to be joining it. I haven't seen an official agreement, but let's say they have. So that's 4 countries versus, the 28 on the Artemis Accords. And so it's not quite the same. And in theory, they're complementary, but I worry they could become, again, a method of competition that could eventually, I don't know, turn into conflict.
Indeed. I mean, I was going to, I want to come on to sort of governance and international rules, but before that, I think you've actually answered the question that I was going to pose, which was about international cooperation between the countries. Generally, there's been quite good international cooperation, but as you elaborate. And my question was going to be, do you see new axes of cooperation, which indeed you've just outlined? So things seem a little fragile, and at risk of breaking apart.
Yeah, I would just, if I could build upon that question,
Yeah,
if that's
yeah,
okay, Jeff.
please do.
Yeah, so actually, I think fragile is an excellent way to describe it. And in fact, what I see are venues of cooperation kind of dissipating over the next decade or so. The US and Russia have a huge joint program in space that they've been doing for almost 25 years now. International Space Station. That we've had humans, we don't talk about that a lot. We've had humans continuously in orbit for going on since 2000. So going on 23, almost 24 years now, which is tremendous. It's a big deal. And that is largely because of, the US and Russia work together on the space station. It has 2 modules. The Russians run one side, and the US and its allies, including the European Space Agency, the Canadians, and the Japanese, run the other. And so they have to work together. That you need both sides for the space station to work. So that has been, I think, a successful way of space and diplomatic outreach. But the International Space Station, as I mentioned, it was launched in 2000. It's getting old. Best case scenario, it lasts until 2030. That's when the United States wants it to go to. Russia keeps making noises about, whether or not they'll continue the whole time. But I mean, at some point it's going to end, right? And so there goes that method of cooperation between at least the United States and Russia in space, because what the US is planning on replacing it with is a series of commercial space stations. And I am pretty sure that the Russians will not be involved in that.
Well,
And the Russians, yeah.
the overall political situation at the moment would seem to make it very hard for further cooperation to evolve. I mean, it looked as though it was all going to fall apart, but it's sort of been patched up as a minimum, but to take that any further would seem impossible, and would seem very much this sort of fragmentation, new axes, and even competition. Let's call it competition in space, but which could lead further. You mentioned there the commercial sector, which is something I wanted to ask about your views as well, because all this has been the domain of governments, of countries, of national interests. There's a certain amount of national interest being reflected through commercial interests. So commercial interests sort of executing on behalf of governments, but there's also a stronger interest, maybe driven by mineral resources, but other maybe even more altruistic motivations. So how do you see this working in this sort of mix of government and commercial? Where do the commercial players sit, and how do they evolve their positions?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, again, going back to the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6 allows for private actors to be involved in space as long as their national governments provide continuing authorization and continuing supervision of them. So
Mm,
in the end, the governments are ultimately responsible for what the commercial actors do. But as you said, because of money, and I think just sheer interest and talent and just different rules. Sometimes the commercial sector has more flexibility in some things than the government does, and so there needs to be coordination there. Like I will point out, the Japanese probe that attempted to do a soft landing on the moon earlier this year, and unfortunately was more of a hard landing. That was a commercial.
yeah.
Japanese commercial company that was doing it. The Israeli effort to land on the moon in 2019, I guess it was, um, also not a government effort. It was a commercial effort. And so we're already starting to see commercial actors trying to get involved in the moon. But as I said, they're under the same governance structure as their national actors are. You can't say, well, I'm a commercial actor, no rules, no gods, I can do whatever I want. It's like, no, actually, you're still bound by the Outer Space Treaty. You're still bound by whatever, national legislation your government has. But it is complicated, because again, when you're talking governance structure, which who doesn't love to talk governance structure? But we're talking, governance structure, for things that are of a shared domain. I mean, typically these are done at the multilateral level, right? And so multilateral, by its very nature, is nation state. It's the United Nations. And so when you have these discussions at the United Nations or other, multilateral settings, how do you bring in the commercial sector if they're going to be truly a stakeholder in this conversation, and if they're going to be maybe leading the way in some of these things and setting the standards? How do you make sure their viewpoints are represented? Again, they should be done, they should be represented by their government. But, having seen it from the US side, for example, the US is, I would say, is very good at, for example, the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS. The US is really good about bringing the commercial sector into its delegation. But I also know the US has to be very careful that they're not seen as promoting one commercial actor over another. They'll just be talking about the US commercial sector writ large, which is incredibly varied. And so I know if the US has problems with this, I'm sure other countries with emerging commercial space sectors have issues with it as well. But, I think in the end, the same goal, the same interest, and there's ways in which to coordinate and to, share the burden and the benefits from doing this sort of exploration.
Well, the commercial sector are going to want some fairly reassuring conditions in order to invest. So they would have a strong interest in having an international, governance set of rules that are respected. I guess the question is, can they be respected?
Yeah, I mean that's just the problem with international relations writ large, right? You're always dependent upon countries doing what they say they're going to do, and you don't really have a global cop that can come and and do these sort of things. But I mean, I will modify that statement you said, Jeff, with a little bit. The commercial sector is very interested in a stable, predictable environment, but they also want an extremely light regulatory touch. And so how do you thread that needle and provide enough stability so that the commercial sector and the private sector are confident in investing in a shared domain such as space, but you don't do it in a way in which that it strangles the commercial sector at birth, But also, how do you do it in a way in which, again, the United States is struggling with this? How do you encourage, the commercial sector when there's a lot of that same ability being done at the government level? And so how do you, encourage the commercial sector while also providing a stability to the government? It's a challenge.
Yeah.
It's
Vol
not new space. I think it's a scientific, a scientific technical issue. I think a lot of countries do, but space, I think, is a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, yeah. Volhar's got a very relevant question, but I don't want to take it right now because I want to go on to explore a little bit more the strategic dimension. Because I mean, the conflict in Ukraine has emphasized the need for space assets, or at least assured access to them. We have EO satellites, which are helping to monitor and understand the picture on the ground. And we see a lot of pictures emerging even into the sort of general civilian domain of those. The Galileo and GPS are enabling positioning and precision targeting, and we see a lot of evidence of the use of that. And also famously, SpaceLink is enabling communications on the Ukrainian side, and enabling rapid communication between forces, which has introduced a number of different tensions, partly because of the commercial nature of Starlink, but also from the sheer, I think, performance of the system. The Russian capability, nevertheless, seems to have fallen behind, which may be also evidenced by the recent failure on the soft landing on the moon, and stands in stark contrast to the Indian success. So, given all these forces going on, what's your perspective on the sort of the geostrategic picture and how that's going to um, lead to new, I guess, I don't really want to say about new tensions, it's what I was going to say, but how do you think it will shake up the picture?
Yeah. Well,
Big question. So
as yeah, I mean, honestly, I see Russia as a fading power in space.
yeah,
If you look at their civil space program, they have a lot of issues. They've had issues with corruption, they've had issues with quality control. This is even before they invaded Ukraine, fall of 2021. There was a law that was put out that said Russian citizens couldn't discuss their space program with outsiders. I mean, that's not a program that's doing well if you have to, gag your citizens from even mentioning it. So clearly it's an issue. And as well as I mentioned, the International Space Station going away eventually, that's going to be, another way in which they're, not going to be able to compete. The Russians have said that they're going to put out their own space station. um, I mean, and during the Cold War, the reasons why, sorry, when during the Cold War, the Soviets had 3 space stations, and that was part of the reason why the United States wanted to work with Russia on the International Space Station. It wasn't just to give their scientists a safe place to go after the Cold War. It was that, okay, they've got a ton of expertise we want to build upon. So don't want to say the expertise isn't there, but the money to do it is absolutely not there. Sanctions have really affected Russia's ability to access technological components, and so I think that's going to be an issue too. And again, for almost a decade after the US stopped flying or the space shuttle, Russia was the only way in which for humans to get back and forth in the space station. But now with SpaceX, there's an alternative now. Um, so I think that's definitely changing. Russia does not have a commercial space sector. That's kind of his historical legacy, truly from the Soviet space program, when they didn't believe in the private sector being in space. So where Russia is still, I think, a powerhouse is through its counter space capabilities, which is kind of unsettling. If you have a former titan of the space age, struggling to maintain its relevance, except where it can do things like counter space capabilities, that's, I think, a really unstable
mm,
element for the future of space security and stability.
yeah,
Um, as well, there's a lot of discussions within the United States as well about where we stand in relation to China. A lot of U.S. government officials talk about China being the pacing factor of the United States. They'll talk things like, and there's a certain element that is pretty hawkish on China. Frankly, the pendulum has swung all the way over to looking at everything China does with, great askance, and, it's being done at the United States. And I'm not saying that there isn't some element of that, but, oftentimes countries have their own domestic constituencies they're trying to deal with. And so, China can go to the moon without necessarily being a way in which to dominate the United States, like maybe they haven't just going to the moon. Um, But it is complicated, and so there are concerns about things that China does that the United States says, okay, well, does that mean that we're losing our spot? Does that mean that they're becoming are they a peer competitor? How do we deal with that? One way that drives me crazy, I'll see U.S. government officials talking about, oh, they've done 100 launches this year, a lot of launches. China, like SpaceX alone did 90 launches. That's one company that's out of the United States. So I think oftentimes there's a bit of I won't say exaggeration, but a tendency to look at and assuming the worst. And I think you need to be clear-eyed in terms of what China is trying to do. And certainly they don't help. They're not a transparent country in many ways. Um, but I think there's definitely a concern there. So there's this US China competition slash, I don't know, contest that's going on there. And then you have Russia deteriorating. So it is in a state of flux.
Yeah.
And that can be destabilizing just in and of itself.
I think this brings us back to our question, the space race to where. Some people have commented or have compared sort of the exploration of space to the exploration of the seabed. And we have international rules which govern the exploration of the seabed. China have pushed the limits of those rules, creating new islands and claiming sovereignty over large swathes of ocean. Would you see, how would you see that evolving in space dimension? Do you see again the limits being pushed? There seems to me to be a big danger here.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see that. My colleague Brian Whedon has actually testified to the U.S. Congress on this issue, and the point that he makes is that independent of what China has done on Earth, if you look at their statements in space, if you look at what efforts they push for in space, if you look at all those things, generally speaking, they respect the rule of law when it comes to space, and generally speaking, they have done whatever the common understanding is there. Now, are there things that they're doing that are irresponsible or things along those lines are questionable? Sure. I mean, one of the ways in which I will say is they tend to scatter their launch vehicles across other countries. If you talk to the Philippines, they're very unhappy about having that debris come back down. And
Yeah.
to go say, okay, a responsible actor should try and launch over unpopulated territories or things like that. But there's no treaty, there's no legal obligation that says that, and so you can't say, well, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. Their Chinese satellites are doing uncoordinated close approaches with US satellites, and so there's a concern about getting a close rendezvous and proximity operation where you get
Yeah.
one country satellite up close to the other without their permission, that it could be done in a threatening manner. And does that mean they're trying to do some sort of counter space effort, or they're jamming, or they're just trying to spy? But again, there's no rule that says you can't. And frankly, the US and Russia do it as well. So I'm not trying to both sides it. I'm just saying in terms of their legal obligations, the Chinese have followed it. There are some irresponsible actions, but there's nothing you could point to say, okay, they're not following what is considered common standard operating procedure or best practices or things like that. That's why there have been these discussions at the United Nations. The United Nations splits up its discussions on space and civil space and security space. So the security space typically are done, UN General Assembly First Committee or the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva. And so they've been having a series of discussions over the past couple of years called an open-ended working group on space threats, where they said, okay, it's open to any country that wants to be involved. And I think over 50 countries eventually were involved. The idea that you identify what's considered responsible behavior and what's considered irresponsible behavior. And how do you call out the bad actors if you don't have a common understanding in terms of what's irresponsible behavior? And so the goal of the open-ended working group was on space threats, and was to identify norms, rules, and principles of behavior that can say, okay, what's considered best practice, and then they would come to a consensus and give a report to the UN General Assembly, and then move from there. They had 4 meetings over the past 2 years: May of 2022, September 2022, January this year, and just actually last week was their final meeting. Unfortunately, they were unable to reach consensus in the overall report, but so that's not unexpected. Frankly, the Russians and Chinese were never, in my opinion, were never going to agree to it. But I think there's a lot of benefit to the conversation because a lot of countries came out of it with an understanding of why space security and stability is relevant to them.
Mm.
And there's even though there wasn't an official report, there still was like gelling coming together in terms of what behaviors countries think are responsible and irresponsible. Like, it's considered responsible to, not deliberately create debris in orbit, by maybe having anti-satellite tests or things of that nature. It's considered irresponsible to do uncoordinated close pushes. And so I think that's been really helpful. And the other thing about countries recognizing that stability and security is relevant to them. For many years, space security and stability issues were perceived like a geopolitical superpower competition. And so it's the US and Soviet Union, then US and Russia, and now US, Russia, China. But if you're a country that either doesn't have a space program, doesn't have its own satellites, you're like, well, what does it really matter to me? And so they weren't really, they're paying attention to it, but it wasn't really perceived as important to them. But I think what a lot of countries came away from this conversation was that, and I recognize I'm talking to a remote sensing community, so you guys are definitely agree with me on this. But pretty much everyone on this planet is in some way, shape, or form a user of space data, and so everyone on this planet has an interest in the continuity of that space data and the continued access and use of. And so I think a lot of countries were like, okay, this is something I need to be aware of it. I have a voice in, and I should be part of the conversation. So I think that's been a really helpful way in which that we're seeing these discussions happen at the multilateral level, and hopefully they're going to be continued. There's going to be hopefully a second open-ended working group that's going to pick up where this one left off, and we'll see how it goes. These things take time, but that's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, I mean, transparency and discussion is obviously highly important. Everybody has an interest. People need to be convinced of that and really made aware. And I guess that um, is also difficult to achieve. Um, Let me bring Wolfhard in. He's asked a couple of questions in the chat. Wolfhard, come and join us. Wolfhard, still with us? Okay. Maybe having problems with microphone, and maybe he's just slipped out for a moment. I mean, he asked a very interesting question earlier about the interests of startups, and we've seen a lot of new companies being formed, um, not just around launches, but also around space exploration. With ambitions as you mentioned, the Japanese attempt to make a soft landing, and we've got many other examples. Where do you see sort of the business case for these companies? Why is there interest amongst the startups to get involved?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One, there is a drop in the cost of access to space that's been pretty tremendous. And so, partially that's due to SpaceX with the launch of the Starlink. When you can chalk up 50, 60 satellites at one time, that's a huge difference. It used to be for the smaller satellites, and frankly, that's what startups typically tend to be, or new space actors are smaller satellites as they begin. They used to have to do ride shares where they'd wait until someone was going to be launching and they'd say, okay, we're a secondary payload. Can we catch a ride with you? And you're kind of stuck going where they want to go. And so, that was a cost. And so as we're seeing, the cost of access to space has dropped a lot. And so that's opened up, I think, democratized a little bit access to space. So, and that leaves an opening for these startups to get involved. And then as well, I think, with apps and, the explosion, I hate to use a term, but of Earth observation capabilities, there's all these new points of data and the uses of space. And so companies are just starting to, we're really at the beginning of how we can use space data. And so companies are trying to develop this. And then some of it's just kind of Me Too type stuff. At one point, someone was keeping track of all the various space launch companies and startups around the world. At one point, there's like 140 companies. Like, there's no way that they're all going to survive. And so there's going to be a kind of a whittling down anyways. But this enthusiasm, I think, is part of that recognition that this is a relatively new territory. I won't say new territory, but relatively new environment. And with the drop of cost of access and just an understanding of this, I think there's interest there. And also the venture capital community, I think, is also finally interested in this. And that's where a lot of the money comes from for these sort of startups.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, and the technology as well, not just the access to space, but the ability to build relatively cheap, low cost, sorry, satellites and um, missions. But that also opens the possibility not just for countries, for companies, but also for countries. And so we have more countries, maybe with a commercial arm even,
Right.
that could gather an access to space, start to construct space missions, but with less noble ambitions and more nefarious ambitions. Though, is there a danger of this? Or do you think that um, the governance can be adapted such that this aspect can be controlled?
I mean,
It's a danger. I mean, first.
yeah. I mean, it could be right around now. I think like 80 countries have their own satellites. As I said, only about a dozen or so can actually launch satellites. I don't know. I mean, you don't need to have a satellite in space to have a counter space capability, to be honest. As I mentioned, our global counter space threat assessment that Secure World Foundation puts out every year, and we have the executive summary translated into all 6 UN official languages, although the basic document is only in English. We look at 5 different ways in which you can have counter space capabilities. One is the direct ascent anti-satellite weapon. That is to say, some sort of interceptor that's from the ground launched towards space at a satellite. So obviously that's a limited number of countries that could do that, right? Another way we looked at it is co-orbital. The idea that you launched your weapon or interceptor into space, it goes into orbit, and then it does whatever it's going to do. It gets close, jams, takes pictures, whatever of its target. And again, so it's a limited number of countries that can do that. But there are things like, directed energy, lasers, microwave programs. You don't necessarily need to have a satellite in space to be able to do that. Things like electronic warfare, radio frequency interference, everyone jams. This is even those countries that don't have space programs, everyone has the ability to do electronic warfare and do jamming. So again, that's not necessarily a space-specific capability, although it has counter space implications. And then also cyber attacks. Again, countries don't need necessarily to have a satellite in space to be able to do a cyber attack against a satellite space system. Space system has 3 parts. It has the part on the ground control station. It has the satellite in space and has communication between the two. And so you could argue that anything that disrupts any one of those is a counter space capability. I will point out it's kind of hard to find open source information on that. It tends to get countries classified very quickly. But one example that we saw very obviously was in February 2022, before Russia invaded Ukraine. There was an attack, a cyber attack against the Viasat ground control network, the ground terminals, because they thought that it interfered with Ukrainian military communications. So again, you didn't have an attack. Again, you didn't have a physical attack. There was no missile launched. It was an attack against a satellite in space. Ground control stations are right here that easier to get to. It was a cyber attack, and so it was reversible and plausible deniability. Russia has never admitted one way or the other, although the U.S. and a bunch of its allies came out May of last year and said Russia did it. So again, again, you don't need to have a space capability to have a threatening thing. I will say I think there are benefits to having more countries in space. The more countries that have skin in the game, so to speak, the more of an interest there is in making sure it's a stable, predictable environment. And I think also it allows the benefits from space to be more equitably accessible to those all around the world. Space is truly the common heritage of humanity. It should not just be for those who can get there first.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And does that apply to these massive constellations as well? Because if everybody launches a massive constellation, we've got a big problem.
Yeah, no, that's Honestly, that's something that's hard to discuss. I think some universities are starting to think about that. You know, if you launch tens of thousands of satellites into an orbital shell, have is there a carrying capacity of an orbital shell? At a certain point, do these things fill up for all intents and
It's
purposes?
truly a
Maybe.
common heritage.
Okay. Not sure what that was.
No,
But yeah. So I mean that's a concern as well that you have a carrying capacity.
yeah,
Or are you essentially appropriating a certain orbit for all intents and purposes? Um, and it's not just, you know, companies like SpaceX. They're doing, you see, OneWeb has a large constellation. You know, the Europeans are planning a large constellation. The Chinese are planning a large constellation. Rwanda put in a bid with ITU for like 350,000. Like clear, you know, again, that's going to be a big issue. And so I think that's definitely a point you need to have a discussion about how do you make sure that, you know, these orbits are not appropriated and you can still get through and coordinate and do space traffic management and spectrum management and all that fun stuff to make sure that the benefits from space are still accessible to all.
you need very good cooperation to make that work. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it becomes a question of first come, first served, and that would I guess quickly fall apart. If anyone wants to ask any questions, please put them into the chat, and please come and join us. But hopefully the discussion is sufficiently interesting that you're just following anyway. Um, so I
I
guess
had one more advertisement I wanted to do, Jeff, if that's possible.
go ahead, Victor.
I'm on a mission here. Um, we mentioned this space security portal that Secure World released a couple weeks ago with Unidir. We actually have jointly worked together on another product that we hope will help with transparency and understanding, and that's a lexicon for outer space security, with the idea that, you know, in these multilateral discussions, um, you know, countries are using terms that have different meanings to different people. Some of the things are pretty understandable. Pretty much we all agree on what LEO means and what GEO means and things like that. But thanks, Natasha. But things like, you know, like from a language viewpoint, in English, there's a difference between safety and security.
Yeah,
But in other languages, in French and Spanish, those mean essentially the same thing. And so we're trying to have these discussions about security and stability and safety and that sort of thing. You know, different countries are coming at it from different ways. And so what we did is we put out a lexicon. We say, okay, this is kind of an iterative process. But we identified terms that came up a lot in these multilateral discussions and said, okay, here's terms that we pretty much everyone agrees on. Here are terms that have difference of opinion. And here are, you know, different possible explanations. We're not coming down one way or the other, but just identifying this is something to think about when you're having these conversations. And then we gathered together experts who were native speakers, again, in all 6 official EU languages to kind of look at it and give us their input and things like that. And so our goal with that is to help in some way help improve the I won't say a common understanding, but just help with a common understanding in these discussions. And again, it's available on our website. Natasha put it there. And then finally, Secure World and Unity are putting together a space security conference next week in Geneva, Outer Space Security Conference 23. Again, it's available on our website, and it's a hybrid conference, so people can attend or listen in online. So if anything we've talked about today is of interest, it will all be brought up even more exhaustively by people much more knowledgeable than me next week over 2 days. So that might be something just of interest as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I think we've pretty well covered the topic. I think the role of the UN and how that evolves is going to be quite critical. Okay, so it's the event is also now look in the chat, and you have a link to the event, and you have a link to the lexicon that Victoria's just talked about. So. I think I guess space has always had this dual capability, and the space race, as it was characterized, was very much driven by pride, but also by defense and security interests. And it seems to me that we're moving back closer to that situation now than we have been for 20, 30, even maybe 50 years. Um, and I hope that I'm wrong, and I hope that the dialogue, the sorts of activities that you're undertaking, the dialogue that's fostered, particularly within I guess, the United Nations, but there are other international platforms for discussion as well. We haven't talked about any of those. Can, as you say, raise the awareness that it's important for everybody. It's not just a question of, okay, well, that's an issue for so and so, or the six big guys or whatever. It's something which touches us all, even the smaller countries. However, factional interests, I think, are going to be quite a significant problem. And I hope I'm not painting too negative a picture, but I'm a little bit concerned about where we're headed. I guess sort of the state of the world at the moment is sort of encouraging a little bit that picture. So I want to try and end on a more positive note. I'm looking for one. Victoria, what can we do? We end on a more positive note.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with anything you just said, Jeff. But I will say, when I was in college right when the Cold War ended and the wall fell down, and studying political science, we had a lot of discussions about which is more stable, a bipolar world where you have two global superpowers,
Yeah.
or a multipolar world where you have the power spread out amongst a lot of different countries. And I think what we're seeing is kind of that happening in space, where it was a bipolar world for all intents and purposes for many years, and now we're seeing a multipolar world where the seats of power have spread out amongst different countries. And so while change can be disruptive, I mean that in the business sense, disruptive does not have to mean destabilizing. It can be. But I think if countries and companies and space actors all have a common interest in making sure that space is sustainable, I mean, that use of space is sustainable and it's accessible to all, then I think there is a way in which to make this disruption time a benefit, and that more countries and more companies have access to space, and they have more of an incentive to make sure that space is a stable, predictable environment. And so if we want, we can end up working together to make sure that it's for the benefit of humanity, if we want. Hopefully that's what we want.
Thank you for that. So I think we draw to a close now. There's a last comment from Wolfhard. Okay, balance of interest between the different actors. Victoria, thank you very much for joining us. I really enjoyed our discussion. It's not often that we sort of reach up to the strategic level. We're much more focused on our Earth observation community. So I hope also that those who joined us today have found it interesting and are happy to carry on the discussion in some way. So good luck with the tools that you've launched. I think they're very timely and will be very useful. And keep up the good work. And give you the last word.
No, thank you, Jeff, and thanks to your organization for asking me to speak in the EOcafe. I appreciate the opportunity. I think oftentimes the space community tends to be fairly rigid in terms of, well, you're a security person, you're Earth observation person, you're a user community, whereas these different changes affect the stability overall for space, and so it's good to talk to each other and cross pollinate. So I appreciate that. We have our website Secure World Foundation, swfound.org. So please feel free to check it out for other stuff. And thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's time and attention.
So thank you, and maybe we come back together again at some point a little bit further down the road and see how things are working out. A key announcement to make. the EOcafe, as you know, we had a fixed rhythm for the EOcafe every other Thursday at 4 o'clock. Unfortunately, I have a problem on the date of the next cafe, so it will actually be in 3 weeks' time. Only the next EOcafe will move, so after that it will still revert to the same 2 week rhythm. So there'll be a 1 week gap between the next EOcafe and the following one. But the next EOcafe then will be on the 28th of September, also at 4 o'clock. And I'll be talking with Federica Mastracci, who many of you may know. She was very active in and around Ersk a few years ago and is now working with Isa and Azzy on the Italian IRRADE program. And we thought it would be interesting for people to understand a bit more about IRRADE, what it will represent, where it's going, as it's going to be an important piece in the European picture in the not so distant future. So that's the next save the date. We'll now close the EOcafe as is customary. We'll keep the cafe open for a time if anyone wants to join in a very even more informal way. You know, we try to be pretty informal, but we stop the recording so that nothing will be recorded from what you say. But and anyone's free just to open up their microphone and join in. Victoria, you're very welcome to stay, but if you wish to leave, you have other pressing engagements, then it's up to you. But this is just generally a free for all now.